Hey guys, hope everybody has been doing well. In today's video, I'm going to tell you guys why I bought a used XT3 instead of the XT5. Now, I had the XT5 on pre-order the minute it dropped because I was really considering buying this camera. I was really excited about the rumors until they got to the 40 megapixel sensor. Now, let's go over some of the features that the XT5 brings to the table, especially over the XT3, which I did pick up a used XT3, guys. And some of my previous videos, I said how great the XT2 was, and I probably should consider the XT3. I broke down and got a used XT3 for $800 on eBay. It's only got like 400 shutter clicks on it. So here's what I considered the advantages of the XT5 over the XT3. One is the bigger battery. The XT3 uses the same battery as the XT2, which is a small little Fujifilm, what is it, the NPW 126s. Where the XT5, as you guys probably know already, has the bigger battery. And not only does it have the bigger battery like the GFX series and the XT4, it takes better advantage. It's probably with the electronics and they're more efficient. I think it's like another 20%, 25% more pictures you can take with the same battery. That's awesome. That's great to see. That was to me one of the biggest things. Now I've you know learned to live with it. I've been shooting the XT2 for many years, and there are things that you can do to save the battery. And it's not a real big issue for me, but it would be nice to have a bigger, better battery. The second thing it has is IBIS, in-body stabilization, the XT5 has, which the XT2 and the XT3 doesn't. And that's been one of my big wants is IBIS, not necessarily for photography, but video. A lot of times I'm doing family run and gun type of things on vacation. It would be nice to shoot with the Fujifilm prime lens and just hit the video recording and be able to get usable, not shaky video. So that's huge. It does come at a cost. Now Fujifilm on their launch, they talk about this is going back to the photography roots, and they're making this camera the same size as the XT1. It's not even close to the same size as XT1. If you look at over the years, the XT1 was smaller than the XT2. The XT3 grew just a little bit. I can barely see the difference, but you can see it grew just a hair. The XT4 significantly. Now the XT5, if you do a comparison of the size, and they have some good photos at the Fuji rumor site, and I'll leave a link to this page in the description, but you can click on the different cameras and it'll do a size overlay to give you a really good understanding of what that size is and how it changes. There it is. So you can see now this is the XT4 versus the XT5, and it's essentially the same thickness. The grip is just maybe a hair smaller, and they shrunk it, the camera width. And people that have held it, I haven't held it. I'm not on the Fujifilm short list to go to their press releases. But the people that have held it said it feels more like the XT3 than it does the XT4. So that's good to hear, but it did grow over some of the previous cameras outside of the XT4. So if you're shooting the XT4, it got smaller, but the other cameras, it grew a little bit. So that's not a huge thing. If you look at the XT3 to the XT5, you can see that it's not much of a difference. And what it did get as far as to the XT3 is a little bit thicker. You can see the overlay and the lines. It got a little thicker, a little meatier, and it looks like it's a little longer as well. So they failed to kind of mention that, unless this picture is 100%. So it did grow a little bit. Not the end of the world, guys. But IBIS is, I'm sure, the reason why they kept the thickness of it. And for me, that is a worthy trade-off, the in-body stabilization. Now, IBIS, it gives you a good, for video, it's great. But for stills, there are some advantages. The advantage on the stills would be on a non-people photograph where your shutter speed, you could dip into the shutter speed. For example, if I'm walking around and there's no people in the subject, because if there's people at all in the subject, I don't like to go below 125 on the shutter speed. Now, if they're kind of moving, walking at a decent clip, 250 is where I like to be, no lower than that. But if there's no people in the picture, then you can start taking advantage of the IBIS in photography. So if you typically would need a tripod when you're dipping below, say I got a 30 millimeter, 35 millimeter lens, hand holding. Again, no IBIS, no lens stabilization. You want to stay, at least I like to stay at 1.5 times or twice the focal length. So if it's at a 30 millimeter, you're looking at about 50, 60 shutter speed, say 60 for the shutter speed. Now, with IBIS, you could crank that down because it's taking that hand motion down, and it might say 5 or 6 stops. And you probably could go 2 stops, 3 stops. That's just my guess. Maybe people pull off more, but see, that's the advantage. You don't have to whip out a tripod for those dimly lit areas. So that is a perk for me. It was one of the biggest things, and I was really on the fence because of IBIS for those reasons. For the video, the run and gun family video, as well as that, let's say, dimly lit scenes with no people in it. So there is some definite advantages of IBIS. I've worked without it obviously for years, and in the end, it wasn't enough to push me to buy the XT5 over the XT3. Now, the other is the price difference. We're talking about 1699 new? Yep, $1,700. I paid $800 for the XT3. Now that camera is what? I think it came out in 2018, 2019, so it's 3 years old now, something like that. And it's used. I bought this used, but in good condition. So I'm rambling on again, guys. I talked about the battery. I talked about the IBIS. And then the sensor, the 40 megapixel sensor. Now, some people are really excited about the 40 megapixel sensor. Not me. I was excited thinking, okay, if we picked up a stop or half a stop of light, I would eat those megapixels because I don't need them. Like most people, I look it on the screen and you wouldn't really be able to, even a screen, this is a 27-inch, you wouldn't be able to see the difference between the megapixel 1-to-1, even on a big screen like this, or even printed, unless you're doing like a huge wallpaper. Only time that comes into play is if you're a portrait photographer, like a higher end, and you want to do these micro touches. You can zoom in to the face and do some cleanup. I don't need that. I don't use that. Or these huge landscapes that you want some ultra high resolution. The third would be cropping if you crop a lot. I don't do any of those things. And typically the manufacturers, the other big manufacturers, I'm talking about Canon, the Sonys, the Nikon, they'll have a high resolution line or a high resolution model of camera because some people need it, some people want it, but they don't really push it down the throat of all of their customers. They don't say, we're going to 45 megapixel or 43 in some cases. I think was at Sony, the A7R was 43 megapixel or is. We don't say, okay, we're switching all the cameras to 43 megapixel. People don't want that. It's bigger's not always better. Sometimes you can pick up a light advantage because you can resolve at a higher level. So, for example, a 36 megapixel might resolve better than a 24 megapixel, depending on the sensor technology, the design, and it can have more detail and it can wash out that noise. So it has a better perceived high ISO because of that resolution. Not the case in the XT5. Multiple people have looked at that. It's not horrible, guys. It's not horrible. It's just not as good as its predecessors, the XT4, the XT3, the XT2. And to me, I wanted to see some difference, a half a stop, a quarter stop, but it actually took a small, very small. It's not a reason to pick one or the other, in my opinion. But for me, it would be worth it if I could get some gain. And that to me is the biggest downside of Fujifilm. Their autofocus is catching up to the big boys, and I mean Canon and Sony. Even Nikon's pretty good in the autofocus. And they still have a little bit of work, but that's there. To me, and it's not so much a knock on Fujifilm, it's the sensor. Um, the sensor size, that is, because the APS-C in low light event, and that's where I struggle. ISO, even on the XT2 and XT3, 3200 is where I don't like to go beyond. 6400 is usable, but you can tell you're at a higher ISO. 3200 and below, it's great. In event photography, shooting indoors, we're talking weddings, and I'm not a professional wedding photographer, just kid stuff in gyms. The Fujifilm, it needs a couple bumps in ISO. And if you looked at, and I don't have those cameras, if you look at a comparison between like this and the A7 IV, when I say this, not the XT3, but there's videos out there, the XT4, which is the same, essentially the same sensor in the same low light, versus the Sony full frame A7 IV, we're talking about a stop and a quarter difference. And for the most purposes, that's nothing, right? That's nothing. But when you get inside, that's a difference between, a usable photograph and an unusable photograph. We're talking about 3200, where I like to be, versus what would be 128 on the Sony. Because the other thing on the Sony, there's when you do those side by sides, even after 6400, it even does decent. It's a usable picture, where again Fuji starts to break up after that 3200. 64 I'll do. After that, I don't. It just, yeah. Again, any picture that for your family, it's better to capture it. But just random pictures, I'll pass. Here's the other thing about the sensors. The legacy glass, the 35 1 for the 23 1 for the 56 non-weather sealed 1.2, the legacy glass, it will only resolve up to like 30 megapixels. So I'm shooting, and I'm not buying these new lenses, maybe one or two, but it won't resolve. So I'm taking these pictures, and I'm not even getting any benefit from the high resolution. Now, there are some other advantages that the XT5 have over the XT3, but really, they don't apply to me. I wouldn't use them. One is the video specs. This thing will do 4K 120, 6.2K 30 frames. I think both of those are pretty significant crops, and some other things. Better autofocus. Now, the autofocus I would use a little bit. Now, the XT3 has better autofocus over the XT2, and I can't tell a difference. I often single point focus or small zone, and I doubt I would pick up some noticeable differences on the XT5. But if you're shooting things that are running like your dog or even sports, the Fujifilm XT5 has a better, more modern focusing system. What else do we got here, guys? In body stabilization, film simulation modes. Now, this is a gripe about me. I mean, it's got all the Fujifilm XT5 has all the newer film simulations. One thing that Fuji hasn't been doing a great job is pushing these new film simulations down to the older cameras. I can't see any reason why they couldn't push it down to some of these in a Kaizen, a firmware update. Fuji's really been slacking. I know I've preached this multiple times on this channel. I wish they would improve that. I don't see a hardware reason where they can't push those down. We're talking slight sliders within the camera. Should be very, very small footprint. Now, another thing that's worth mentioning is there's no longer a battery grip available for the XT5. So if the battery grip is your jam, XT3, XT2, XT4, the XH series, I think, has them as well. But no, the guys are pushing you to the XH, the new XH series. There's no longer a battery grip for the XT5. Some, it's a big deal. It's a game changer, especially if they're wedding photographers. And it's for two reasons. One is the battery. Although this battery is good, not as good as having a whole bank of batteries, or at least two batteries in a grip. The other is the grip itself. A lot of people shoot portraits, especially at events. And if you have a battery grip, you usually have like a grip that you can hold your camera vertically like that. Maybe there's some aftermarket grips that pop up that'll just attach to the tripod mount on the bottom. I don't know. But it does tick off a lot of people. Not me. I don't have any plans, never did want a grip. I've lived with just this, but I'm not a pro. It is a big deal for some folks, just not me. So those are the reasons I chose to go with an XT3 used, because you can't buy them new anymore, versus the new XT5. Now, my opinion may change, and I may pick one up as real people start to post around the XT5, or if I hope, keep my fingers crossed, they come out with an XT5 that it's a lower resolution. I'm even okay if it's not an X-Trans. That would be fine for me. Or if it was even pay a little bit more, even though the rumor has it that we're not going to see a stack sensor, I would pay a little bit more, get the stack sensor, and I just prefer that lower 24-ish. 30 would be fine too, megapixel sensor. So that's it, guys. I'd love to hear your opinions on this. Please leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.